So at the end, our terminal objective is at the end of this module to be able to define and talk in detail about the lead and copper rule. What's in the rule, why we're monitoring, and all of that. We're going to look at the regulatory overview of the lead and copper. We're going to talk about the health effects of lead and copper on individuals of different ages. And we'll look at sampling methods for lead and copper. We'll talk about the action levels. Who knows what the action level for lead is? Point. If you put a 0 in front of that, I'll be happy. 0.015. Of course, the goal is 0. Copper. Huh?
It's a lot higher.
It's a lot higher. 1.3. Good. So we'll talk about those action levels. We'll talk about what is done in percent time. We'll talk about the public education as it relates back to notification with the lead and copper rule and different types of treatment options that are out there. Who understands why the lead and copper rule came into effect? Somebody got sick?
I thought it was only incestuous people would be affected by this. That's what someone told me.
Conservative. It was developed to protect public health, as with many of the rules and regulations that EPA put out. Studies are done. We see the health risks associated with the various contaminants that are there, and when there is a known health risk, then again, it comes under the regulation. There are more than 65 contaminants that are currently regulated. There are many, many more that are unregulated, but the microscope is on where they're looking at those contaminants for future regulation. But it all boils back to how does it affect public health? Is there a health risk associated? And yes, they did determine there were health risks associated with lead and copper, and lead and copper was used in so many applications. How many of you all have lead service lines? Or still have them even now? Yeah. Copper lines. I know in the city we still have quite a few of them. Jack mentioned earlier about making those joints, bell and spigot joints with lead. Do you not know there are still places today in 2013 that they do the repair still with the lead? Yeah.
They gotta be talented.
Sometimes you have to.
Sometimes you have to.
Yeah, sometimes you do. We did one down here to
It's
fix the
cheaper.
child in Arlington. It was the only way we could fix the main, other
It's
than
with it.
taking a third of the town out of water,
You know,
shut it down.
The phone lines went our way and gas, you're talking major reconstruction of an intersection.
So it's cheaper. So it's still out there. There are no health risks. And again, it's not that with those that are currently like that, already in place, there are some cases where, again, that they still allow the use of lead. But as much as possible, we want to minimize it because of the known health risks associated with lead and copper. The most common source of lead and copper in drinking water is corrosion of your plumbing materials. And again, when you look at that, a lot of people say, well, why does it become a problem? If it's with the home plumbing, why are we penalized? Why do we have to continue to collect and submit and all? Why do we have to replace the lines? Because initially that's what was in place, of course, was that the utility replaced the line, and some of them at the owner's expense. Protection of public health. You all are the champion of the environment. Okay? All right, so the materials that can be made with lead and copper include pipes with solder and fixtures and faucets. So EPA established the lead and copper rule. Lead and copper rule established the action level for lead, 0.015 milligrams per liter or 15 parts per billion. and for copper, 1.3 milligrams per liter, of 1,300 parts per billion. And this is based on the 90th percentile, and we'll actually show you how to calculate that 90th percentile level. Because just because I have one sample exceeding these action levels, do not put me into the additional monitoring. I have to look at and calculate the 90th percentile. When I exceed that, that's what increased the frequency of the monitoring. No more than 10% of your samples can be above either action level, and if lead and copper levels are found above the action level, again, it does not signal a violation, but it can trigger a lot of other requirements that now you have to start doing, such as water quality parameter monitoring. What do we mean by water quality parameter monitoring? Now we're looking at the pH, we're looking at the polyphosphate, if we're using that, alkalinity. There's a whole lot of other different water qualities that we have to start monitoring in addition to putting these lead and copper samples. Jack, you're about to insert something in? I saw your mouth.
I'm just,
Okay. In addition to the water quality parameter monitoring, especially your large systems, it's not a suggestion. With the largest system, you must start corrosion control treatment. With your smaller systems, they give you a little leeway there. And what do I mean by a smaller system? Under 3,300. Larger systems, you don't have a choice. You got to start implementing that. Okay. Source water monitoring is another thing that you may have to start doing. Public education, and again, lead service line replacement. All these parameters are part of the lead and copper rule. Okay. Again, in the past, lead and copper was widely used, and I think, is that Ray or is that Dickie O said, because it's cheap. As with a lot of the things that we did in the past, before we knew the ramification, after all of the analysis, okay, it was widely available. Okay, just like the clay pipe now, that's a headache and some cheap, widely available, put it in. And now you got root intrusions and everything else. Asbestos cement, best thing since sliced bread, and then we found out what? Cancer causing. So again, a lot of times we utilize things, we do things before we know the full ramification. So now we have to go clean it up, go get it right, go try to rectify it. As far as lead exposure, primary cause of developmental problems in children. In other words, it's dumbing us down by coming in contact with the lead. It's messing with our IQs, our mental capabilities. They banned it from paint in the 70s. And again, it's a ripple effect. Yeah. Copper. What does copper do? Well, one thing I know is that it's probably not as bad as lead, since the action level of lead is 0.015 and copper is 1.3, so it must not be as bad, right? And it probably is not. But when there's excessive amount of copper, it increases the effect from other contaminants, such as nitrates and nitrites. Now, with the increased effect of nitrates and nitrites, I have issues with blue baby syndrome. What's blue baby syndrome?
Lots of oxygen getting into the brain.
Absolutely. At the very young, it will affect those that are under 6 months of age primarily. And again, when you have high levels of nitrates, nitrites, extra copper in there, then literally they suffocate because their blood cells take in the nitrate, nitrites, as opposed to the oxygen that is widely used. And without that, that's why they call it blue baby, is because of suffocation. So the purpose of the lead and copper rule, as with the purpose of any rule, is to minimize any ill health effect or risk, minimize the exposure to our customers, especially from drinking water. Promulgated again in 1991, we looked at the goals, and the goal is 0. Probably will never achieve the goal. 2007, there were minor revisions to the rules, and we'll actually look at those minor revisions today, okay? So, lead and copper rule established requirements for community water system. Remember, community water system is any system with at least 15 service connections for 25 individuals on a year-round basis, providing piped water for human consumption year-round basis. For non-community water system, it optimized corrosion and periodic sampling. In other words, with your non-community or non-transient non-community water system, it's not something that they're going to do ongoing. So it's just looking at optimization of corrosion control. Give an example of a non-community or non-transient community water system.
Camping area.
Okay, that would be it would be a non-community transient, very good. Give me an example of a non-transient, non-community water system, all these acronyms.
Trailer park.
Now, will a trailer park be here or here? Because in a trailer park, I have people that live there year-round and need piped water for human consumption. So that will be a community. Okay, your mobile home parks. That's what you meant by trailer park, make sure I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay, schools, daycares, factory. We have 25 of the same individual, more than 15 service connection. And non-transient meaning that 25 of the same individuals. Okay. All right, copper, we saw this earlier, blue baby syndromes in infants and young children. Again, it's magnified with the nitrate ingestion there in conjunction with copper. The other effect is gastrointestinal effect, which can be anything as simple as cramping, diarrhea, to something more serious. The same in adults, the gastrointestinal effects. Lead, the list is longer. Now we have low birth rate. We have slowdown of physical and mental development with lead association. Damaged hearing, reduction in attention span. That's why no one can sit today in class. Poor classroom performance. This was quite interesting to me on the adult side, especially this right here when you look at the number of people with increased blood pressure today. Kidney damage. Huh? What was that, Greg? Drank a lot of water that was lead laden, huh? No. Damage to reproduction system. So you can see how critical it is to remove this or to make sure that it's not in the drinking water we're supplying to our customers, or to minimize their exposure, even if it's just through education. And what I mean by education, how many of you all, when growing up, your mama would always tell you let the water run until it changed temperature, or let it run before you take that first quid? Mom used to tell me that. I don't know why. I don't even know if she knew why. It's colder and better for you. Yeah. Now, if you had a high hit of lead and copper, you want to make sure that, again, you notify the public, and in your report, there are certain statements that they specify that should be a part of it. Infants and young children are typically more vulnerable to lead in drinking water than the general population. Elevated levels of lead can cause serious health problems, especially for pregnant women and young children. Lead in drinking water is primarily from materials and components associated with service lines and home plumbing. This is standard language that must accompany your reports. We want to give them information on how to minimize the potential for lead exposure. Again, educate your public. Tell them to flush their lines 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Wait till you get that temperature change. What are we actually doing? Remember, we've already established that lead and copper, what's happening is leaching out from the home plumbing, right? That stagnant water that's been in your pipes overnight more than 6 hours. So if you can make sure you flush that out, when you have fresh water coming in from your mains, you minimize the potential exposure. We also want to let the public know if they still have concern about the levels. Give them a number where they can have their water tested. Give them a number where you can answer the questions that they may have. Now, you may not want to put a particular name on the form, but you can put a position and a number where they can contact for information. Now, the EPA says the system may write its own education statement. However, you must get the approval or consult with your state primacy agent. If not, you got to use the language that they specify. All right, now specific instruction for sampling and testing. We're going to look at selection of sample points, collection of the samples, analyzing the samples, and any other additional data gathering information that's needed for the samples. Can I just go pull any sample from anywhere out of my distribution system? Is there a certain criteria where I need to get the samples from? Yeah, and we're going to look at 3 different tiers for sampling for lead and copper, based on the age of the home and whether or not it's a single-family residence or multi-family residence. Okay, and we want to make sure that we're getting, if we have lead service lines, at least 50% of our samples must come from our lead service lines. So there are criteria that are laid out in the lead and copper rule that we must abide by. The size, again, of the water system determines the number of samples, population, just like with the water form. All right, so they have the small systems. We have the small systems pointed out because of the training was supposed to be geared towards small systems. Small systems under 3,300, we're looking at from 501 to 3,300, 20 initial sample taps for lead and copper. And water quality parameters, sampling sites, at least 2. Now, after I did that initial round of lead and copper and everything came back A-OK, then there was a possibility of reducing the number of sampling sites to 10. But I still have to continue to have the 2 sites for my water quality parameters. For larger systems, I saw quite a few of you all put on the sign in that you were around 10,000. So for those systems, initial sites, we're looking at 40. Again, we can reduce down to, let me get the right one, 20. And so what you see in a lot of cases, it's a reduction of cutting it in half for the reduced monitoring. However, if I have less than 100 people, I still have to maintain how many sampling sites? 5. Why? Because EPA says for many of the rules and regs, you have to have at least 5 sampling sites. So there was no reduction there. All right, the revisions that we spoke of earlier, 2007, as far as sampling sites, they wanted to make sure that you're utilizing taps that were used for human consumption, such as a kitchen or bathroom sinks. In other words, I cannot go to the janitor's sink to pull lead and copper. It has to be a place where, again, people are drinking from this particular fountain or sink. Systems with fewer than 5 taps and sample all taps at least once. Take repeat samples on different days until you have a total of 5. This was another component of the revision. Your primacy agents have the discretion to allow systems with less than 5 samples to collect 1 sample from each tap. Again, that can be used for human consumption. So if you have less than 5, they may give you the okay just to do the pour and not do additional days to get to the 5.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
These services are people.
As far as the number of population, the number of samples,
Yeah.
number of samples are based on population. Okay? As opposed to a tab. Now, can I guesstimate the population based on the number of tabs? Yeah, there is a number that you can utilize in order to get there too. But this is actually based on population. All right, if your system had less than 5 samples, you were required to use the highest test result as the 90th percentile. Again, we're going to talk about exactly what that means. So if I have less than 5 samples, the highest test result is my 90th percentile. No longer am I looking at taking 0.9, which is 90% converted to a decimal point, multiplying it times the number of samples in order to determine my 90th percentile. Fewer than 5 samples or fewer, the highest one is my 90th percentile. Other revisions, it allows reductions to lead and copper sampling frequency to once per year, but it will also require systems to collect at least 1 sample per tap that can be used for human consumption. And also can be further reduced to once every 3 years. And this is if you have no problems, and we've exemplified this. EPA will allow the systems to collect fewer than 5 samples, but you have to at least hit each sample tap for human consumption. All right, let's look at what the 90 percentile calculation is. For example, if you have a system that collects 5 samples, you're going to first put them in order from the least to the highest. Here we have 5, and the highest for lead here was 0.02. Well, we know that the action level for lead was what? 0.015. So I can start getting frantic right now, right? No, we go further. Multiply the number of samples by 0.9 to determine the sample that represents the 90th percentile. So I have 5 samples, multiplied by 0.9 gives me what? 4.5. So now I'm going to go back and average, because 4.5 comes between samples number 4 and 5. So I will go back and I will average the 4th and the 5th highest sample. When I average them, 0.011 plus 0.02, divided by 2, add them up, divide them by the number of samples, which is 2, I get 0.0155, which means what? How much? My 90th percentile is 0.02 because of that number. Okay. So then I compare that number to the action level. If it's greater, then I've exceeded. Okay. If it's not, I'm going to do the same thing for copper, for the results for copper. So that's 5 samples. Keep in mind, if it's under 5 samples, automatically this is my 90th percentile, whichever sample is the highest. If I have a system with 10 samples, I'm still going to put them in order from least to greatest. Once I do that, multiply the 0.9 by the number of samples. The 9th sample in this case, because I have 10 samples, times the 0.9, my 9th sample is my 90th percentile, 1 there. Okay, so I'm going to compare it to, which was 0.02, so we're still going in the same direction. I'm going to compare the 0.02 to the 0.015, and of course in this one, I've exceeded again. With systems that collect less than 5 samples, you're looking at the highest level being your 90th percentile. And keep in mind that this one, not more than 10% of your samples can exceed that. That will constitute an exceedance. Okay. Any questions? Okay, good. No questions on that? And they actually have.
If you have only 5 samples,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no 10%.
Even if you have 5, what you're saying, Ben, what's 10% of 5? A half of the samples will be 1 sample. So in essence, yeah, we still got a 10%. 1 exceedance there. So we now know how to calculate whether or not we've exceeded, where we're going to pull the samples from. Types of sampling sites must be approved in writing, just like with the total coal form sampling sites, must be approved by the state agency. And what they want you to do is to look at the 3 tiers and determine your sampling sites based on the 3 tiers of sample. Tier 1 site criteria, single-family structures that contain copper pipes with lead and solder installed after 1982, and or may be served by a lead service line. So you're going to pull some of your samples from there. Tier 2, your multi-family structures, buildings that may contain, again, copper pipes, lead and solder installed after 1982, or could be, again, served by the lead service line. And Tier 3, we're looking at those single families that were installed prior to 1983. So 2 sampling tiers after 1982, 1 single family only prior to 1983. For your non-transient, non-community systems, again, those daycares, those hospitals, where you have workers, same 25 people coming in, you can only use the Tier 2, Tier 1, and Tier 3. So again, in both cases would be single family structures. One prior to 1983, the other one installed after 1982. Then after you have pointed out where all of these people are, and usually you can do a survey to gather that information, 50% of your sample collected during each monitoring period must come from sites that contain lead pipes or copper pipes, lead solder, 50% served by lead service line. Okay. Now, when collecting these samples, you must follow an approved method. Now, you can have people to do it within your organization, or you can ask and request the public, because a lot of the samples came from where? Single family residents. You can request them to collect. If you request the public or the customer to collect, you cannot come back after the fact and say, the customer screwed us up, that's the reason we failed. Can we invalidate this sample? You've taken that off of the table as a negotiation when you allow the customer to collect. So you want to make sure, if you're utilizing customers for collection, that again, you give them the written sampling procedures to follow, and you explain to them how they should collect these samples. So you don't have any failing, because what's wrong, Tom?
Just thinking that you're supposed to take a sample after 6 hours. What nutcase is gonna let you in there on to take the first sample?
First sample in the morning.
Yes.
So you're gonna have to rely on the customer. So we have to do due diligence to do what? Make sure we communicate with them proper sampling techniques. Make sure they don't turn on that hot water, as some people get up in the morning and do because they want the hot water, you know. So you wanna make sure they understand that. Make sure they don't let the water run and then collect the sample, although it may look good for you, but you want to make sure approved methods are done, implemented, so we can see if there's an issue.
Can you test them to see if they've ingested enough lead so that they can't understand the instructions?
That's actually not a bad idea.
Yes, sir.
Some of the old containers are still out there, and they had the acid in them. And a lot of people were getting burnt with the acid, so the new canisters that use our collection bottles do not have the acid in them, because so many people were getting burned. And they didn't realize that they were supposed to collect it first thing in the morning, and they would go in there and make a big old pot of coffee, and then they would make a sample. They had to wake up with the lead that was in the coffee. Yeah.
Coupled with the caffeine, that really gave me a jolt. Yeah, very good. Now you want to make sure again, because the whole purpose of the testing is to see whether or not the lead and copper is leaching out from the plumbing. So we want to make sure that they understand this sample is to be collected after the water is motionless for at least 6 hours. However, no more than 18. Okay, 6 hours, but no more than 18. Because if it's in there longer, then what's the possibility of a hit? It's been in there 24, 36 hours.
Lots of
Uh, Yeah, but keep in mind, you can't change or challenge the results, so if they have not followed it correctly. Yeah, so you gotta make sure that you are explaining this to them. So they have their 1 liter, and as Jack said, now they're allowing the labs to acidify the samples after the fact. I wonder how many of those people actually probably try to sue their utility after that happens, get some money. All right, collected from a cold water tap, not the hot water. And what was the other criteria? Must be a tap in consumption. So the kitchen, the bathroom, not outside. I don't know, some people may drink out of their utility, but not typically. So you want to make sure you tell them exactly where you want them to collect it from. Systems may not challenge the results if the residents are allowed to pull the samples. All right, now from the lead service line, we want the water flushed out because we actually want the water from the lead portion of the line, right? So how do we determine how long to flush in order to make sure it's the water from the lead service line?
Temperature.
We can go by temperature. You can actually get out there and do the calculation. Yeah, moving that water as Jack was showing us. So make sure again that we flush the volume of water between the tap and the lead service line. You can also tap directly into that lead service line. That will eliminate a lot of improper sampling there. So if it's from a single family residence, remember to explain to them this time around for this particular sample, we need you to allow it to run until there is a temperature change and give them some idea of how long that should be. Don't leave anything up to their interpretation or question is the key there. Now, with the small or medium systems exceeding the action level, they must monitor the following at the taps and entry points to the distribution system. We're looking at, and these are those water quality parameters. Remember, if I had a small system and I was collecting 20 sites for lead and copper, I have to have 2 sites for water quality parameters. I'm doing pH, alkalinity. Why is pH important if lead and copper exceeds? What does pH have to do with lead and copper? Corrosion, absolutely. Low pH. So I'm doing pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate or silica if inhibitors are used. Calcium, conductivity, and water temperature. Those are the water quality parameters. If I want to be on the reduced monitoring, guess what? I got to do these also and show them that these are all within line. All right, so in order to qualify, which is where everyone wants to be for the reduced monitoring, you must be below the action level for the previous 2 6 months period. You have to exhibit that. And you must include the parameters of the water quality test for 2 consecutive 6 months. So, for lead and copper sampling requirements, initial monitoring period, we're doing those water quality parameters. We're doing it at the tap and at every entry to the distribution system. We're doing it on a 6 months basis. If I had issues and I've installed corrosion control, we're still doing pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate, or silica if applicable for helping with corrosion. We're doing it at the taps. We're doing it on a 6 months basis. I'm also monitoring my alkalinity dosage rate as well as what inhibitor dosage rate that I'm utilizing at the entry point to the distribution system, and I have to do that at least every 2 weeks. So it's a little more frequent than the 6 months. If the state specifies parameter values for optimal corrosion control, I'm still doing that initial water quality parameter at the taps every 6 months, as well as all the dosing rates at the entry point to the distribution system at least every 2 weeks. If I'm on the reduced monitoring because, hey, everything came back hanky-dory, for the water quality parameters, may continue at the taps, but now it may not be every 6 months if I'm on the reduced monitoring. It could be annually, or it could be every 3 years at the reduced number of sites. Will we ever get to the point where we will not have to do lead and copper monitoring? Do you think? Why not?
Not in our way.
Money, money-wise.
Money-wise, so you think it's all a part of putting money in someone's pocket?
Too costly to replace it all.
Okay, so in other words, we have to continuously exhibit that the quality of the water being delivered and the minimization of the exposure to lead and copper is consistent, is what you're saying, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, analyzing the samples, again, you must use an approved method. Now here, for the water quality parameters, and we were talking about this earlier with Hugo. If you're doing pH or any of those analysis there, you don't have to have a certified lab to perform those water quality parameters. Temperature, pH, polyphosphate. If your lab is not certified, but yet they can run the test with the approved method, it is okay for them to do those parameters. However, for all lead and copper monitoring, you must utilize certified laboratories. Okay. So the methods for all the quality, water quality parameters, you can find them in EPA 141.23. Again, with the lead and copper, it must be conducted by a certified laboratory. A lot of times we just use the state laboratory for that type of monitoring. Now, reporting requirements. The report is due within the first 10 days following the end of each applicable monitoring period. So if you're doing a 6-month, you're on that 6-month rotation, at the end of the 6 months, you have 10 days to get that report into the state. How many days? 10 days, very good. And that's applicable if you're doing it on every 6 months, annually, 3 years, or every 9 years. So you can be on a reduced cycle where you're just doing it every 9 years. 10 days after that cycle, you have to make sure that information is turned into the state. The 90th percentile lead and copper concentration measured from among all lead and copper water tap samples must be reported, as well as the results from the sample collected at the entry points, all the water quality parameter during the 6-month monitoring period. All of that must be reported within the first 10 days after the monitoring period. You also want to make sure that you inform the homeowner where you pull the sample from, what the results were. That's a courtesy. All right. Notify the state for approval if you're going to go out and find a new water source. Let's say it was a problem with your source water and you want to change that in order for that to serve as your corrective action. You got to get the approval from the state. If you're changing long-term treatment schemes, such as dosing changes, and you're using the same chemicals, but you're increasing the dosage or what have you, you have to notify the state. If you're switching disinfectant, secondary disinfectant, or coagulants, or if you're switching corrosion inhibitor products, all of that must be approved and you must notify the state before you make those existing treatment changes. All right, we've already said we're going to report within 10 days. That's the same with your source water monitoring. You got 10 days following the end of the monitoring period to turn that report in. Failure to collect from specified sites must be accompanied with an explanation of why the sampling point changed, and you got to make sure it's a valid reason too, and not just because every time you go back there it comes up high. All right, corrosion control treatment reporting. You want to make sure again, if you're looking at optimizing corrosion control, that information is given to the state, what you're recommending to do. Any demonstration about the optimization that you are currently under must be submitted to the state, as well as the data that you're using to evaluate the effectiveness of whatever changes you made or treatment that you're doing. All of that must be submitted to the state. As well as a letter certifying that if the state tells you to do something, hey, it's in place within the time frame that they've set for me to put it in place. Okay. That letter, especially if it's accompanied with a treatment that's designated by the state, that letter must be turned in within a 24-month period. Usually they'll give you about that time to get the treatment in place. Okay. Now, lead service line replacement. When this rule rolled out on the carpet, there was another stipulation of the rule. If you had lead service line, then the utility must start to do what? Replace them. And they even gave you a percentage on the number of replacement that you should do on an annual basis. So, in the rule, it says that you should schedule at least 7% replacement on an annual basis. And they even went as far as giving you a time frame within the first 15 years that the rule went into effect. Have you all been doing that? He said, I'm not sure, don't take it, you're doing it.
We were.
You were initially?
We were, nothing to do right now.
Oh, why did they stop?
They're questioning whether the partial lead service replacement's actually effective. They think it's making it worse.
Oh, really? And you know what? Studies have shown once you start that replacement, you do get an increase for whatever reason. And that's where, again, we notify the public even more so when you were doing the replacement that your levels may go up. And so here in Rhode Island, they put a stop on it for right now. How much higher, if I may ask, did you all see the samples?
It's not that much higher. I mean, when we started it, we were just barely over the action.
Okay.
But
It also depends on how long, after this, the length of time it takes for it to go back to where it was before the law.
Right, so it took a while for it to,
no, short time.
short time, okay.
Yeah.
So it was effective, but that initial time was spiked, is what they were concerned with.
And it was effective in our state, in our system, but
Other systems.
Washington and other places, they had a lot of activists and they seem to think that they had other studies that showed otherwise, so nobody knows.
Okay, and all of y'all are tied in together up in this area, huh? Okay. All right, so if you exceeded the action level no later than 12 months after the initial monitoring period, you needed to demonstrate in writing to the state that you're doing an evaluation. And remember, with that evaluation, we also have a game plan that we're submitting to the state for corrosion control. We are identifying the initial number of service line, lead service line in the distribution system, also supplying them with that schedule for replacement. After the fact, you want to make sure that you're still conducting sampling that demonstrate that, again, lead concentration in your service lines fell below the 0.015 action level. So if we exceed it, now also the question is, do we need to notify the public? And if so, what should we tell the public? Okay, because it is the public that's using the water, and again, they've already established it's mostly from plumbing. So it behooves us to educate the public in order to minimize the exposure. So you want to make sure, as far as public education, part of the lead and copper rule says, provide a list of newspaper, radio station, television, facility notice. Provide that to the state where you made your public notification. If you collected extra samples, they too must be reported. Record keeping must be retained for no fewer than how many years? 12 years. So we're reporting after 10 days, but you have to hold on to those records for 12 years. And what I always say about any type of records, even though they give you a time frame for retaining them, hold on to them for a lifetime. Archive them somewhere because you never know when, you know, the request will come or there's an issue. So
What constitutes, maintaining a record? Does it have to be paper?
does it have to be paper? If you have, you can do electronic, but you better have backups to it. Because our state, and I'm not sure about the other states, our states are, Texas is moving away from paper.
Well, the reason I ask that is because, some of the forms that were used for record keeping are no longer around. Try to find a 5.5-inch floppy, 5.25-inch floppy disk somewhere, or anything to read it. And, you know, like CDs and so on are pretty much out of sync now, and you use
Yeah.
flash drives. And so, you know, I mean, you have to keep taking those records and put them into,
Paper format.
well,
And
either
true to
paper
the
or
matter, when we
something
were
that's
doing
up to
that
date.
right there, we had the hard copies anyway to back up there. I just say have multiple tiers of record retention, one that you can readily get to. Greg, and then I'm gonna see if Jack has any
I
input on
think
that.
you have to keep like updating them, that's what it is.
Oh,
If you
no,
have it on CD and they don't use CDs anymore, you have to put it, you have to keep moving it from paper to.
From- just in a form where you can get to them if need be. So if that means I gotta go to a library that has these capabilities, I have to find a particular record, I may have to do that. Jack?
Government agencies are going to a form probably more like PDF, and they're standardizing PDF to where as long as PDF is gonna be the federal and state format, then they will always be able to use it because it's set up on different arrays, and each cell is specific. And that's what they're going to is PDF. And so you can store it on any computer. Probably, they're hoping to put it all on, not on a Microsoft or, you know, Apple. They'll probably go to an AS400 system database. And that's where we store, that's where they're leaning for.
Yeah.
That's what the states are all leaning to.
Huh?
You have paper charts.
Paper jars?
No, charts.
Oh, paper charts, okay. I just said paper jars, so what just came to mind was this little old room with a lot of jars with paper stuff in it.
Charts.
Yeah, charts. And in cases like that where you do have a paper form, I would suggest, again, boxing them up, and you may have to pay someone to archive it for you. You might have a room, nothing but files.
That way the Russians can find it.
We found another
Jack's
top one.
military.
We'll have to translate it to Chinese.
All right, remember the action level that is .015 milligrams per liter for copper 1.3. And again, if they exceed the 90th percentile, we have to leap into action. And part of that action is doing the water quality parameter monitoring. We're going to collect samples from the taps every 6 months. At the entry point, every 6 months prior to corrosion treatment. After corrosion treatment has been implemented, we're going to at least every 2 weeks. Reduce sampling if parameters are met for 2 6-month period, then again, we may be reduced or put on that reduced monitoring on an annual basis, and further reduced on every 3 years. And keep in mind, if you look at EPA guideline, you can get on a reduced monitoring for once every 9 years for many of these parameters. All right, for corrosion control treatment, as we said earlier, large systems, you don't have a choice. You must implement some type of corrosion control. Small and medium systems are only required to do it by the state if the state deems it necessary. They'll give you 18 months to complete the study. Larger systems will have 24 months to install their treatment processes. Okay. Small systems can stop, even if the state told them to go ahead and start implementing some type of corrosion control, and that is if they can demonstrate that we are under the action level for the 2 consecutive 6-month period. So although you may have initially been put on some type of corrosion control treatment techniques, smaller systems can come on, but you got to be able to demonstrate that. All right, source water monitoring is a must if the action level is exceeded. You need to get 1 set of samples for from every entry point to the distribution system. And again, they're required every 6 months of the first exceedance. You have 24 months to implement your source water treatment. For groundwater systems, you're monitoring every 3 years. Surface water systems, you're monitoring annually. And again, even with this, reduced monitoring is possible. Now with the reduced monitoring, you have to request it after you've demonstrated, hey, everything is going well for the 2 consecutive 6 months. All right, I think we talked about public educational material earlier. The content of the written public educational with that specified language from the EPA. We're going to let the public know the health effects of lead. Where are the possible sources coming from? How to get their water tested, posted in places frequented by women and children. And the reason being because remember, pregnant women and children are the ones that are mostly affected, mostly susceptible. Let me put it like that. Is that a better way of putting it? And again, notify customers where they pull the water for you, notify them of the results. We talked about this as far as service line replacement. Notify the public when you're doing this, because there may be elevated levels during the time of replacement. Okay, compliance options. You can perform corrosion studies. You can add orthophosphate or silica-based chemicals, which probably would be the easiest way to implement and to comply. You can add alkaline-based chemicals such as lime soda ash. Just keep in mind, corrosion happens when the pH does what? Takes a dive. If I can maintain that pH at a certain level, above 7, then I minimize the possibility of corrosion, right? Who said,
It's clear as throat.
Okay. You can do calculation of the stability index. What's something that's real simple for the operator to do, pH and alkalinity, using the Baylis curve. That will determine whether or not your water is scale forming or corrosive, just by having those values that you're doing anyway. So make sure whatever treatment that you are going to implement, that it's approved by the state agency. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, or issues for lead and copper rule? Dave? No questions? Do I make it too easy for us? How many of you all are on the reduced monitoring? Increased monitoring? Why?
Well, again, because of Providence.
Oh, Providence?
Yeah, we're tied in, so we tend to, whatever goes on with them, then that's what the state requires us to get extra. So,
And why do you think they have the hits?
oh, it's just an old, just an old city. Yeah, just, they took some lead and copper stuff before I started working here. They said that if they got the levels of lead that were in the soil in Providence, they put a lead mine in there.
Wow.
Because there's that much from all the old paint and all the stuff in the soil. It's amazing.
What about the rest of your systems? In the same boat of walking pretty right now? or that's someone else to deal with. Add it to it, yeah. Excellent. You have anything else you want to add, Jack?
One of the things you mentioned is a slight increase in the lead readings after you replace the lead service line. And of course, most of the time when you're replacing the lead service line, you're going from the main to the meter. But when you go from the meter to the house, when you de-water that service line that attaches or goes into the home itself, their air gets in there, okay? And that air reacts with the lead in the pipe. And that's what is causing that lead to leach back out.
Okay, so like as you were pointing out earlier, with the corrosion issues with oxygen and carbon dioxide.
Right, CO, CO2, and all those different gases will react back with the lead copper.
Now, you go to the meter, you go to the property line.
We go to the property line.
Yes, a lot of us in this area, we only go to the property line, you're only talking 4 feet from the clear box.
Is that what it is?
So you're talking sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50 feet to the house, or even into the meter. So it could be, and I had one, well, maybe 15 years ago, it was led right to the house, 125 feet later.
25 feet.
Wow.
That was one on Oak Street, remember? Solid lead right to the house.
Okay, the house is, Mount Roseville, that's what I'm saying.
So there's another one, it's solid
They
lead.
sent letters to them a million times.
That's pretty good, and that's a lot of lead.
Inch and a quarter letter.
Yes.
Inch and a quarter.
Yeah.
A lot of fish, baby.
Yeah. Wings, fish wings, that's what we use them for.
Yeah.
So you all are still using the lead weights even on fishing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You just had some fish from it.
Yeah.
Gold?
No,
Uh-oh.
but you
The
still
fish
have
doesn't eat the
contact.
lead?
Well, the point is to kill the fish anyway, right?
Yeah.
They go stupid first, they take with a club.
What do you get the call if they so good for?
Oh, yeah, exactly, that's why I love it.
Just try to pull up.
She don't even, she calls them something funny.
It was different,
You
that's
didn't
what
try-
writers
try-
say.
Did you try a clam?
I tried it.
Try to
I
stuff
really
them
tried.
all?
Yes, I tried.
She has a very bad gag reflex.
We told him.
Yeah.
Tried to-
No, when I heard it,
Did you
No,
try a
it's not
clam?
that.
she wouldn't try it.
Did you
You
try
wouldn't
the
try a
co-op?
clam, man?
Did you try the co-op?
No. The,
I did
I did yesterday.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Stuff co-op. They didn't have chorizo in it?
Hmm?
They didn't have chorizo in it?
No.
Oh.
It was in the shale, they put it in the shale.
Did you eat it raw or cooked?
No, it was cooked.
You only do a slide, you kidding me?
No,
They served it in the
right.
shell over there.
And stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, stuffings, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because usually the stuffings around here are like.
Especially not.
No, well, they have, I just didn't
They
have.
probably had it in it, they wouldn't
Yes.
have
Yeah.
it, unfortunately.
Well, yesterday, he was asking